So most of the show obviously going to be dedicated today to the Supreme Court pick of Brett Kavanaugh by Donald Trump. I mean, look, it was there's an interesting report out, actually. I'm going to talk to Scott Lemu about it. I don't know to what extent he'll have any comments on it or know anything or if there will be any relevance. But just in terms of the just to layer the impropriety over impropriety. I mean, look, the bottom line is the Democrats should never have even showed up at the Gorsuch hearing in the first place, because that was literally a stolen seat on the Supreme Court. We now have reports that the Trump administration was in negotiations with Justice Kennedy for months to negotiating the pick of this is well. I'll just read from Jeff Bennett. I think he is he's an NBC News White House correspondent. Source familiar tells NBC that Justice Kennedy had been in negotiations with the Trump team for months over Kennedy's replacement. Once Kennedy received assurances it would be Kavanaugh, his former law clerk, Kennedy felt comfortable retiring. Now, look, this works two ways. One, it implies, hey, maybe this guy Kavanaugh is, as moderate is too strong a word, but is not as is less rabid and less of a partisan hack than other justices on there relative to Kennedy. But I would also argue that when you look at Kennedy's decisions this year, he is deeply compromised in the decisions that he made in favor of the Trump administration across the board, if he is trying to convince Donald Trump to pick his replacement. I mean, this is highly, highly inappropriate. Not to mention the past couple of weeks, the floating of other lunatics who might be this Supreme Court pick, all just for show. But it is one more aspect that makes this this whole proceedings compromised. And just to give you a sense of what Kavanaugh will do, because, look, he will not answer any questions when it comes to his judicial opinions, or I should say, held beliefs. But here is a little hint as to how much regard Kavanaugh will hold precedents such as Roe v. Wade. Here he is at the White House. This is, I think, just before or just after he talked about how great his mom was and how great his girls are, except for the one that's too chatty. Anybody catch that?
No.
Where he said,
What did he say?
I've got two daughters. Betty, I can't remember their names. Betty, who loves to read loves sports, and Mary, who loves sports and loves to talk. And then they all laughed because
nice.
How yes.
And the other one who should shut up.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. She talks too much. All right. But then, because he's pushing the whole I've been around women. I know women. I came from a woman. Therefore, don't worry about Roe v. Wade. That's
How could I be sexist? My mom
How could I be
was a woman.
sexist? I literally was born of a woman. I mean, could I really be sexist?
I love me mom.
I love me mom. Here he is also, though. Here is the hint. Listen to the words when we hear him say, he is one of those original intent guys and strict constructionist, which of course is just a BS way of saying I can divine what was in the minds of men 200 years ago, and I am not actually divining anything because it's so obvious, except for the fact that we know it's not obvious because I'm willing to overturn precedent, and he indicates that by saying precedent does not control him. Does not control his decisions. They merely inform them like anything else.
My judicial philosophy is straightforward. A judge must be independent and must interpret the law, not make the law. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent.
We'll play that later. But basically what he says is a judge must interpret statutes as written and must interpret the Constitution as written, which is just absurd. I mean, words, that apparently there's no idioms that exist, right? Informed by history and tradition and precedent, but only informed by precedent. So he has a fairly loose attachment to precedent that may exist. And, you know, whether or not they launch a frontal assault on Roe v. Wade is in many respects immaterial to the exercise of that right. But there's a whole host of other issues that, both from a legal perspective, that are super important, and particularly in terms of the politics about fighting this nomination. And really, when we talk about fighting this nomination, we're talking about slowing it. We want to push this nomination past the date of the November election on the off chance, it's not so remote, that the Democrats could possibly take over the Senate. We will talk about all of those things with Scott Lemieux in a moment.